Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again. This is Jay Shapiro. Thanks for listening. A recent survey by the Pew Research Foundation found that more than two-thirds of Americans support the Black Lives Movement. While we all wish that blacks and all minorities, including the Jews, benefit from equal opportunities and protections offered by the U.S. Constitution, this high level of backing raises the question of how much does the public really know about the Black Lives Movement. Very few people read their charter and comments made by their leaders. The leaders of the movement openly admit that they want to abolish the nuclear family, abolish the police, abolish prisons, and abolish capitalism. And furthermore, they are anti-Semitic. They also funnel money to the Democratic Party through various organizations. I've done a little bit of background research about the Black Lives Matter movement, and I want to share it with the listeners. Also, the pandemic has made lots of people dependent on the social media for information, and the social media is controlled by a number of media organizations, and it enables all kinds of opinions to be broadcast to a broad audience and has now become a useful organ for misinformation generated by anti-Semites. This is a major problem, and it is a new problem. The dissemination of anti-Semitic lies online and unfounded information about Jews is literally thousands of times greater than it was just 5 years ago and goes out to a much greater audience than previously. It is a new problem and one that has to be resolved. If it is all resolvable, it may not be resolvable. I speak a little about these topics on the program today because I've done a little bit of research, and it's sort of frightening what I've found, and I want to share what I've found with the listeners. Thanks again for listening. I'll be back after the break.
G'day, I'm Jono Vandor.
And I'm Ross Nichols.
Join us on our program, Israel on My Mind, a show that broadcasts all the weekly goodness that flows like milk and honey from the Holy Land straight into your ears with humorous and happy news stories.
New shows are posted every Thursday at 7 p.m. Israel time, highlighting the lighter side and advancing a positive view of Israel here on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. This program is devoted to what's happening in the Jewish world, both in Israel and outside of Israel. And sometimes I have to talk about things that don't seem originally related to the Jewish world, but have a very strong influence. And I'd like to say something now about what's happening in the United States, particularly about a movement called Black Lives Matter, because it's affecting the United States. It may probably affect the election coming up in a few months, and that will have a strong effect on Israel, depending on whether the Democrats or the Republicans control Congress and the presidency. A recent survey by the Pew Research Center found that more than two-thirds of Americans support the Black Lives Matter movement. It's called BLM. While certain institutes and doubtless many others wish that blacks and all minorities benefit from the equal opportunities and protections offered by the U.S. Constitution, the high level of backing of BLM raises the question, how much does the public really know about the Black Lives Movement? Now, it turns out that BLM's leaders openly admit they want to abolish the nuclear family, they want to abolish the police, they want to abolish prisons, and indeed, they want to abolish capitalism. Black Lives Matter uses an organization called Thousand Currents, which is an IRS-approved organization as its fiscal sponsor. IRS approved means people can donate to it and take it off their income tax. Donations made on the Black Lives Matter website are processed by this left-wing group called Act Blue Charities, a donation platform affiliated with the Democratic Party, and then the money is transferred to the organization Thousand Currents, which then distributes them back to Black Lives Matter. Now, for example, Hawk Newsom, the leader of the Black Lives Movement Greater New York chapter, wrote in the New York Post on June 25th of this year, and I quote, "If this country doesn't give us what we want, then we will burn down this system and replace it, all right? I just want black liberation and black sovereignty by any means necessary." BLM is also obsessed with U.S. President Donald Trump, who arguably has done more for African Americans than any other president in recent memory. And Tammy Bruce, a U.S. commentator who I often see on Fox News, wrote in the Washington Times in June 14th of this year, and I quote, "In reality, this has nothing to do with black lives and everything to do with liberal Marxist anarchists having hijacked, as they always do, an important social issue which they will undermine the very communities and people they claim to represent," unquote. National companies, philanthropic foundations, and private citizens have been donating tens of millions of dollars to Black Lives Matter, and a recent survey by the Pew Research Center has found, as I said a moment ago, that more than two-thirds of Americans support the Black Lives Movement. While Gatestone Institute, which is a research institute, and doubtless many others wish that blacks and all minorities benefit from equal opportunities and protections offered by the U.S. Constitution, the high level of backing of BLM raises the question, which I brought up a moment ago, how much does the public really know about the Black Lives Movement? The anti-American agenda of Black Lives Matter, which under the guise of fighting racism, seeks to transform the United States into a communist country. BLM's leaders openly admit that they want to abolish the nuclear family, they want to abolish the police, they want to abolish prisons, and they want to abolish capitalism. Their leaders have threatened to burn down the system if their demands are not met, and they have also created, in the meantime, black militias. Black Lives Movement has lifted much of its agenda from radical leftist groups active in the United States during the 1960s and 1970s. BLM is an ideological descendant of the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers, the Black Liberation Army, and the Weather Underground, all of which sought to overthrow the U.S. political system. Their innovation is twofold. First of all, it has successfully employed intersectionality, which I've discussed in the past. Intersectionality as a concept seeks to relate all kind of groups that have gripes and make them work and prove that they work together. They use identity politics to stir up a broad range of grievances that actually extend beyond race. It includes class and gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, immigration status, and other identity markers. Also, they're anti-Israel. This ensures that BLM offers something for just about anyone claiming victim status, and it has successfully leveraged social media to agitate mob hysteria and funnel rage into a political movement with a large online reach. As you can see, that's what's happening in the United States. There are places where riots are taking place for weeks already. And in New York City, what's happened is it's gotten the support of the mayor. The co-founder, Patrice Cullors, signed an anti-Israel statement, again falsely accusing Israel of colonialism, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing. The statement exhorted blacks to support the BDS movement to try to crush Israel economically. In May of this year, participants in a BLM protest in Los Angeles, California, vandalized at least 5 synagogues and 3 Jewish schools with anti-Semitic graffiti. They also ransacked and looted Jewish businesses in downtown Los Angeles and in the heavily Orthodox Fairfax district. Their obsession with the U.S. president and his support of Israel is very upsetting because not only has the U.S. president done things for Israel that his predecessors didn't do, but arguably he has done more for African Americans than any other president in history. In August of 2017, the co-founder of BLM, Patrice Cullors, wrote that BLM would never talk with U.S. President Donald Trump, and I quote, "We wouldn't, as a movement, take a seat at the table with Trump because we wouldn't have done that with Hitler. Trump is literally the epitome of evil, all the evils of this country, be it racism, capitalism, sexism, homophobia, and I want my children to know that I resisted a president at all costs because this president literally tried to kill our communities and is indeed killing our communities." And of course, the BLM is trying to remove Trump from office. And one of the reasons they're so opposed to Trump is because he's pro-Israel. So the bottom line is that this whole protest is a protest against Trump and against Israel. So the Black Lives Movement that many Jews are supporting is simply because they have no idea what the basic agenda of the Black Lives Matter movement is. It is something which is not good for America and is not good for Israel. And in both cases, whether vis-a-vis Israel or vis-a-vis America, their attitude toward the Jews is essentially antagonistic and hateful. The Black Lives Movement, you see all kind of protests but people holding up BLM signs. Many of those people holding up those signs are young Jews, have absolutely no idea what the movement stands for, not only vis-a-vis America as the nation that it is, but apropos to their attitude toward Israel and toward the Jews. And it's really frightful. I'll be back after the break.
Hi, everyone. This is Andrea Simento from Jerusalem, inviting you to drop everything and join me on my show, Pull Up a Chair. We'll visit this week's quirky stories, meet fabulous guests, and discover my Israel. Together, we'll laugh, shout, and explain the topics that make us say, hey, we've got to talk about that. So get comfortable and pull up a chair with me, Andrea Simento, every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
And me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. In the previous segment of the program, I spoke about the anti-Semitism in the Black Lives Movement. I want to say a few more words about anti-Semitism because it's rearing its ugly head again. In the dominant issues of the day, what are the dominant issues? It's the coronavirus. And in the United States, this is combined with the struggle for black rights. And they have been manipulated to fuel almost unprecedented levels of anti-Semitism. There was a lot of anti-Semitism before the coronavirus. The anti-Semitism has been called the measles of humanity. It's always around, sometimes more, sometimes less, but it's always there. And once in a while, something happens that gives it an excuse to break out. 2019 produced some of the worst statistics on anti-Semitism recorded in the United States. Online anti-Semitism via social media and other channels really skyrocketed and translated into a growth in attacks on Jewish people and on Jewish property in almost every country around the world. Haters jumped on the outbreak of the coronavirus, disseminating vile anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Now, what happened was the economic and social stress of this pandemic got bigger. A lot of people are out of work. A lot of people are stuck at home, and it's time. And they spend a lot of time on the internet, and on Twitter, and all these other social media. So it's a great channel for spreading whatever you want to spread. So now there are allegations that the Jews are responsible for the virus. The Jews are using the virus for profit. The Jews are using it to gain political control. All kind of reasons. Many of the accusations were really bizarre, and yet they seemed to spread, and people who received some of this stuff continued and spread it. So essentially, it's the old blood libel of centuries that has come back now to haunt us. Now, far-left groups in particular, helped by the Palestinian Authority, by Hamas, and by Iran, deployed the same themes to blame Israel and Zionism. In other words, Israel and Zionism are being used as a surrogate for the Jews. When people attack Israel and Zionism, sometimes they don't even mention the word Jew. They assume that when you say Israel and you say Zionism, it's like saying Jew. So what's happened is a global crisis now, this pandemic, and it's been hijacked by haters of the Jews. And Jews are falsely accused of all kind of things like infecting Palestinian workers with the virus, pouring infected water into Palestinian areas, all kind of stories like that. Now, there is, as far as the black Americans are concerned, they felt that they're perhaps not getting a fair deal. And once again, ideologues rush to ride this wave to promote their own hateful agenda. From the left, there are organizations like Amnesty International and the Jewish Voice for Peace, which is simply a group of Jews who are actually anti-Semitic. There's all kind of organizations drawing a direct line between things like police brutality in the United States and the Israel-Palestinian conflict. For example, when this black fellow Floyd was killed, they claimed that the police were taught military tactics in Israel, and Israel essentially is the blame for what's being done to blacks. All of a sudden, in some of these rallies where they're carrying signs that said Black Lives Matter, they began to show signs that say Palestinian Lives Matter. And there's all kind of anti-Semitic slurs. It was no coincidence that in Los Angeles, violence targeted Jewish buildings. Now, from the right, the political right, the white supremacists took equal advantage. All kind of conspiracy theories and all kind of disorder, and inciting the masses became commonplace. Jews were portrayed as privileged whites, profiteering off the back of everyday Americans, and far-right groups called on black protesters to target Jews in a classic case of killing two birds with one stone. They pitted one perceived enemy against the other. What's happened over the last few months are really very upsetting. What we see is what happens when anti-Semitism against Jews as individuals and part of a community or represented by Israel is all pushed together and allowed to flourish. When the classic bigoted anti-Semitism of the right meets the anti-Semitism of the left, it's more dangerous than ever. It's intensified by the social media, which are essentially echo chambers, which reinforce the feelings of marginalization and detachment. The social media are a fertile ground for extremism and hatred, and in particular against the Jews. For example, there are a lot of people out of work today. So their lives are unstable, there's social unrest, there are threats to law and order, some of which is even protected by the government. In other words, there are cities like Seattle and Portland where the governmental authorities allowing all this disorder to take place. So there's a tremendous failure of responsible leadership. So the entire world order appears under attack. Now, what happens is that Jews are invariably the first victims of chaos. Additional minority groups and others may also eventually be attacked, But the very values and the very institutions of democracy are being attacked, and those in responsible positions, particularly in the large cities in the United States, are simply not taking their responsibility the way they should. They're allowing this to happen. So this global tide of instability is intensifying. So there should really now be concrete steps against anti-Semitism. There's a lot that can be done. If you look at the major networks like Facebook and Google and TikTok and Twitter, actually define calls to violence against Jews as a violation of their terms. But it gets much more complicated when it comes to forms of anti-Semitism. When Twitter, for example, falling far beyond the others and adequately coping with anti-Semitic hate speech on its platform. So Twitter has become a hotbed of hate, and the executives and the representatives are not doing anything about it. By the way, the leader in fighting anti-Semitism is Google, because they have specific terms that cover anti-Semitic conspiracies, as well as Holocaust denial and demonization of groups based on ideas. And of course, they're against calls to violence. The others like Facebook and TikTok have definitions of hate speech, but it doesn't seem to cover anti-Semitism properly. I do not believe that censorship will lead to a better world or more tolerant communities. Social media platforms should adopt the official definition of anti-Semitism and use it as an educational tool to reduce anti-Semitism. And what's been happening now is that the social media, which do not have total control or choose not to have total control of what's being said on their media, are a tremendous market for anti-Semitism. Just about anybody can say just whatever they want. So good things can be spread, and unfortunately bad things can be spread on social media. And one of the bad things is anti-Semitism, and it looks to me, at least, like it's getting out of control. So the social media have become another tool in the arsenal of anti-Semites. And those who run the management of the social media have to be much more careful in how they define anti-Semitism and see to it that it doesn't spread. It is a very difficult situation, one we could not have predicted just a few years ago, but it's there. I'll be back after the break.
Leap of Faith with Penina Taylor.
We live in the age of information, but not inspiration. If you're like me, you're looking to be inspired to reach higher, to connect more, and to grow. Well, if you want to get warm, you need to stand close to the fire. And if you want to catch fire, you need to stand close enough to get hit by the sparks. Join me, Penina Taylor, as we walk with people who have embarked on a spiritual journey towards Torah. We'll uncover what started them on their journey and what truths they discovered along the way. So prepare to be inspired as we take a leap of faith every Sunday at 5 p.m. on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. It's kind of depressing to talk about anti-Semitism all the time, but it is a reality. In the previous two segments of the program, I spoke about the Black Lives Movement and the fact that it's anti-Semitic. Then I spoke about anti-Semitism in general, which is growing in America because of the pandemic and the economic situation and so forth. So without trying to depress the listeners, I want to say a couple words about what's happening in the European Union. The European Commission is the executive and bureaucratic arm of the European Union. And ostensibly, the European Commission is committed to fair, indiscriminate treatment of political actors both within and without the Union when they evaluate the entire world. The European Commission allegedly interacts with all equally on the basis of respect for human rights, for social justice, and for equality. It sees itself and the European Union as a champion against occupation by outside powers over territory not their own and territory that was conquered by force. At the same time, it is a champion of equal treatment of states outside the European Union. Now, Israel is considered by the European Union as an occupying power, even though some of the greatest legal minds in international law question whether Israeli rule in the West Bank, rule that resulted from Jordanian aggression, was ever in fact an occupation, as sovereignty over the areas were never recognized by both states. Two of the people who essentially defend Israel one is the late Eugene Rostow, a former dean of Yale Law School, and he was the undersecretary at the Department of State. And there are other legal minds who have taken his position. Now, the truth of the matter is that only Great Britain and Pakistan recognized Jordan's annexation of the West Bank back in 1950, which constitutionally to this day has never been abrogated by the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. By the way, I don't think anybody, including Great Britain and Pakistan, recognized Jordan's annexation of Jerusalem itself. According to them, Jerusalem was, according to the UN resolution of 1947, to be an international city. So when I said Great Britain and Pakistan recognized Jordan's annexation of the West Bank, it was all of the West Bank, not including Jerusalem. The name West Bank was the name given by Jordan because previously under the British Mandate, and even before that under the Ottomans, that area was called Judea and Samaria. That is an anglicized version of the biblical expression Yehuda v'Shomron, which we still use. So Jordan essentially illegally annexed and called the West Bank because the main part of the nation of Jordan is on the East Bank, east of the Jordan River. So they gave the side on the west of the Jordan River the West Bank. The word bank, it's not talking about a place where you put in money. It's talking about the bank of the Jordan River. So but even if we assume, for purposes of a mental exercise, that Israel occupies the West Bank, let's look what's happening around the world. Turkey military occupied northern Cyprus in 1974. China occupied Tibet in the 1950s. Morocco occupied parts of Western Sahara in 1907, and they are still there. They're still occupying these areas. Like Israel, all three of these other countries have colonized contested land. China and Morocco, to a large extent, Turkey on a much smaller scale relative to the existing populations. So there are countries in the world like China, Turkey, and Morocco who occupy areas that are not theirs. There is, of course, a crucial difference. Only Israel has a deep historical claim to the area it occupies. The Jewish scriptures contain 24 books, the Bible, the prophets, and they refer to Judea and Samaria, the Jewish tribes that inhabited them, and the places they inhabited in the areas hundreds of times. So frequently are they mentioned that it's abundantly clear that Judea and Samaria were centers of Jewish life for thousands of years. Now, if you do a search function of the European Commission's internet site, and this was done by a scholar here in Israel, he used the word military occupation rather than simply occupation, because the occupation produces thousands of documents and areas. The results entering is this. If you do a search, you find Israeli military occupation gets 85 results, Turkish military occupation gets 3 results, Moroccan military occupation gets 2 results, and Chinese military occupation gets no results. So, considering how proud the European Commission is that it treats all states fairly, it's hard to understand why Israeli military occupation, as they call it, of the West Bank receives nearly 30 times more consideration than Turkish occupation and colonization, and over 40 times more than Moroccan occupation. Why is the Chinese colonization of Tibet not viewed as an occupation at all? So it's interesting. The European Union claims to be impartial, to be fair, and to treat everyone equally. How could a European Union that brings together citizens of countries whose roles in the Holocaust range for the most part from barbarous, like Germany, to the infamous, like Poland, the Baltic states, the former allies to the Axis powers, how could the European Union so clearly discriminate against the Jewish state? So, what we have here is what's called geopolitics. What's geopolitics? It's essentially the politics of power. By the way, the European Union rhetoric tries to deny geopolitics. So, geopolitics is essentially the reason for the slight or kid glove treatment of China and the partiality towards Turkey. See, but it hardly explains the Moroccan case, because the weakness of Arab states for the past 3 decades at least. What happened is, although there is a lot of division in the European community, it seems to have one issue over which it clearly can rally. That is blaming Israel, the Jewish state, for just about everything. And that is very unfortunate. The European community claims to be committed to peace in the Holy Land. Peace is only going to be achieved on the basis of recognition that Israel has deep-rooted historical rights, that that area that they call the West Bank and that we call Yehuda v'Shomron, Judea and Samaria, It secured that area in a war in 1967, that a war that Jordan initiated in its bombardment of Western Jerusalem on the first day of the Six-Day War. So this is the situation. The truth of the matter is that the European Union could play an important role in facilitating peace in the Middle East by recognizing the reality and the history of this area. And unfortunately, that is something which the European Union is not doing. So it's an unfortunate situation. When I look back over the 3 segments of this program, I seem to be rather pessimistic. But what I'm trying to do is really paint a picture of reality to the listeners. A lot of this stuff is under the headlines, and you don't hear much about it. But anti-Semitism is growing in the United States, and it's being further multiplied because of the pandemic. And the European Union is continuing the merry way of Europe, which is to be, if not directly anti-Semitic, anti-Israel as a new form of anti-Semitism. Thanks again for listening. And I apologize for being so pessimistic this week.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom! Okay, wait a minute. Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling from the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.